Imagine it's 1998. You're a career statistician at the Bureau of Labor Statistics in Washington, D.C. You've spent 23 years calculating the Consumer Price Index. You know every methodology, every adjustment, every data source by heart. And this morning, you're staring at a memo that instructs you to implement changes that will fundamentally alter how America measures the cost of living. The memo comes from the top. It references something called the Boskin Commission. And as you read through the technical adjustments, hedonic quality adjustments, geometric weighting, substitution effects, you understand exactly what these changes will do. They will make inflation appear lower, not by a little, by a lot, permanently. You're not being asked to lie. You're being asked to change the definition of truth. You have a mortgage. You have 2 kids approaching college age. You have a pension that depends on your continued employment. And so you implement the changes. Because what else can you do? The commission was bipartisan. The economists were credentialed. The methodology is defensible on paper. And nobody, not the press, not the public, not Congress, will ever understand what just happened. That was 27 years ago. Today, the official inflation rate in the United States hovers around 3%. The Federal Reserve declares victory. Headlines announce that inflation is under control. And tens of millions of Americans look at their grocery bills, their rent, their insurance premiums, and wonder if they're losing their minds. They're not. This isn't theory, it's documented methodology. The way America measures inflation was redesigned deliberately to produce lower numbers. Not once, but repeatedly over 4 decades. And the reason has nothing to do with accuracy. The reason is a debt. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Let's start with what most people believe. They believe that inflation is a straightforward calculation. Economists at the Bureau of Labor Statistics track the prices of goods and services over time. If prices go up by 3%, that's the inflation rate. Simple, objective, mathematical. They believe that when the government announces inflation is under control, it means that the cost of living has stabilized, that the dollars in their bank account are losing purchasing power at a slow and manageable rate. They believe that the methodology for measuring inflation is determined by scientists and statisticians working in good faith to capture economic reality as accurately as possible. All 3 beliefs are incorrect. The Consumer Price Index is not a neutral measurement. It is a political instrument, and its methodology has been systematically altered, always in the same direction, for reasons that have nothing to do with accuracy and everything to do with the federal government's fiscal obligations. Here's what most people don't understand. The CPI isn't just a number economists discuss on television. It's the number that determines cost of living adjustments for Social Security recipients. It determines adjustments for federal pension payments. It determines the interest rate adjustments on Treasury inflation-protected securities. It determines the inflation adjustments on tax brackets, which affect how much every American pays in taxes. In other words, every time the CPI goes up by 1 percentage point, the federal government owes billions of additional dollars. And that creates an incentive, a massive, structural, permanent incentive to ensure the CPI stays as low as possible. This isn't a conspiracy. It's public record. The changes are documented. The commissions published their findings. The methodology adjustments are available for anyone to read, but almost no one reads them, and so almost no one understands what actually happened. Let's begin the autopsy. In 1980, the official inflation rate in the United States peaked at nearly 14%. It was a genuine crisis. The purchasing power of the dollar was collapsing. Interest rates hit 20%. The political class was terrified. By 1983, something changed, not in the economy, in the methodology. Before 1983, the housing component of the CPI measured actual house prices and mortgage interest costs. This made sense. Housing is the largest expense for most American families, and the cost of buying a home is the clearest measure of what housing actually costs. But actual house prices were rising faster than the Federal Reserve wanted the CPI to show. And so, in 1983, the Bureau of Labor Statistics replaced actual housing costs with something called owner's equivalent rent. This is a remarkable concept. Instead of measuring what it costs to buy a house, the BLS began measuring what homeowners would theoretically pay if they were renting their own homes from themselves. Think about what that means. House prices could double, as they did between 2012 and 2022, and owner's equivalent rent might only rise by 30%, because actual rents, constrained by what tenants can afford to pay, rise more slowly than asset prices fueled by cheap credit. The 1983 change, by itself, reduced the reported CPI by an estimated 2 to 3 percentage points annually during housing booms. This wasn't an accident, it was a design choice, and the design produced exactly the result it was intended to produce. But the 1983 change was just the beginning. In 1995, the Senate Finance Committee commissioned a study on the accuracy of the CPI. The committee was led by Senator Bob Packwood and included economists Alan Greenspan, who would later become Federal Reserve Chairman, and several others. The study became known as the Boskin Commission, named after Stanford economist Michael Boskin, who chaired it. The commission's conclusion was striking. It determined that the CPI overstated inflation by approximately 1.1 percentage points per year. The commission recommended a series of methodological changes to correct this alleged overstatement. Now, here's what's crucial to understand. The commission's central argument was that the CPI failed to account for two phenomena: substitution effects and quality improvements. Substitution effects work like this. Imagine beef prices rise by 20%. In response, consumers buy less beef and more chicken. The old CPI methodology would count the full 20% increase in beef prices. The new methodology reasons that since consumers substituted chicken for beef, the actual impact on their cost of living was lower. On paper, this sounds reasonable. But think about what it actually means. If every product you want to buy becomes unaffordable and you're forced to buy inferior alternatives, the CPI says your cost of living hasn't really increased. You've just adjusted. By this logic, inflation is never truly a problem. If steak becomes unaffordable, you eat ground beef. If ground beef becomes unaffordable, you eat beans. If beans become unaffordable, you eat rice. At each step, the substitution effect reduces the measured inflation rate. Your actual standard of living has collapsed, but the CPI says prices are stable. This is the measurement lie. It doesn't measure whether you can afford the life you had. It measures whether you can afford some life. The second major adjustment was hedonic quality adjustment. This is where the methodology becomes almost philosophical. Hedonic adjustment attempts to account for improvements in the quality of products over time. Here's an example. In 1995, a mid-range personal computer cost $2,000. In 2005, a mid-range personal computer also cost $2,000. But the 2005 computer was dramatically faster, with more memory, more storage, more capabilities. The BLS reasons that since you're getting a better computer for the same price, the effective price of computing has actually fallen. The CPI records this as deflation in the computer category, even though you spent exactly the same number of dollars. Again, on paper this seems logical, but in practice it creates systematic downward bias. Consider healthcare. Medical procedures have become more sophisticated over time. An MRI in 2024 provides better imaging than an MRI in 2004. By hedonic logic, healthcare prices haven't risen as much as the dollar amount suggest. You're getting better care, but you still have to pay the bill. The hospital doesn't offer a discount because the technology is better than it was 20 years ago. You don't get to pay 2004 prices for your 2024 MRI. The hedonic adjustment exists only in the statistics. The same logic applies to cars, appliances, electronics, and dozens of other categories. Prices stay flat or rise, but the CPI records falling prices because the products have theoretically improved. Who decides how much quality has improved? Government statisticians, using models, with assumptions baked in. And somehow, the adjustments almost always push the CPI down, never up. Let me put this in perspective. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, cumulative inflation from 1983 to 2024 was approximately 207%. $1 in 1983 has the purchasing power of about 33 cents today. But if you apply the pre-1983 methodology, actual housing costs instead of owner's equivalent rent, without substitution effects, without hedonic adjustments, the picture looks radically different. John Williams, a private economist who runs a site called Shadow Government Statistics, has been calculating CPI using the original methodology for 2 decades. His calculations suggest that true cumulative inflation since 1983 is closer to 850%. By this measure, a 1983 dollar is worth about 11 cents today. Now, Williams's methodology has its critics. Some of his assumptions can be questioned. But even more conservative alternative calculations, those produced by the Chapwood Index, which tracks the actual prices of the 500 most commonly purchased items in major American cities, show inflation running roughly double the official rate in most years. The gap isn't small. It's not a rounding error. It's the difference between an economy where workers' real wages have stagnated and an economy where workers' real wages have collapsed. And here's the mechanism that makes this matter. When Social Security benefits are adjusted each year, they're adjusted according to the official CPI. If the official CPI says inflation was 3%, benefits rise to 3%. If real inflation was 6%, retirees lose purchasing power every single year. This isn't theoretical. It's happening right now. It's been happening for 40 years. Let's examine who benefited and who paid. The primary beneficiary of understated inflation is the federal government. Every percentage point of understatement saves tens of billions of dollars annually in reduced obligations. Social Security alone pays out more than $1.4 trillion per year. If the cost of living adjustment understates true inflation by just 2 percentage points, the government saves roughly $28 billion annually. Over 40 years, the cumulative savings and the cumulative losses to retirees run into the trillions. Federal pensions work the same way. Military retirement benefits work the same way. Veterans benefits work the same way. Then there's the tax code. Tax brackets are adjusted for inflation each year. If inflation is understated, the brackets don't rise as fast as they should. Taxpayers get pushed into higher brackets faster. This is called bracket creep. It's an invisible tax increase that happens automatically, and it's directly caused by CPI manipulation. Treasury inflation-protected securities, or TIPS, pay interest based on the CPI. Institutional investors buy these bonds, assuming they're protected from inflation. But if the CPI understates actual inflation, TIPS holders receive less than they should. The government pays less than it owes. The difference is a hidden default, not in name, but in real terms. Add it together, and the fiscal benefit to the federal government is staggering. Multiple studies estimate that the cumulative savings from CPI methodology changes exceed $4 trillion over the past 3 decades. That money didn't disappear. It was transferred. From people who hold dollars to people who owe dollars. From retirees to the Treasury. From savers to debtors. From the middle class to the government. This isn't unique to America. History shows that governments always manipulate measures of currency value when debt becomes unmanageable. Argentina provides a recent example. Under the Kirchner administrations from 2007 to 2015, the government systematically falsified inflation statistics. The official rate claimed inflation around 10% annually. Private economists measured it at 25 to 30%. The government responded by threatening economists who published alternative figures, even making it illegal to publish unofficial inflation data. Why did the government lie? Because Argentina had issued inflation-linked bonds. Higher official inflation would mean higher debt payments. The incentive was irresistible, so they changed the number. The International Monetary Fund eventually censured Argentina for its data manipulation, a rare and humiliating rebuke. But by then, millions of Argentines had suffered through years of hidden currency debasement, their savings eroded by an inflation rate the government refused to acknowledge. Venezuela followed a similar path. Official inflation figures became so disconnected from reality that the government eventually stopped publishing them altogether. When the truth became too embarrassing, they simply stopped measuring. These are extreme examples, but they illustrate a pattern. When governments face a choice between honest accounting and fiscal survival, honest accounting loses. Every time. The United States hasn't reached Argentine or Venezuelan levels of manipulation, but the direction is the same, the incentives are the same, and the mechanism is the same. Now let's examine why this can't be fixed. This is the trap. As of 2024, the United States federal debt exceeds $35 trillion. Annual interest payments on that debt now exceed $1 trillion, more than the entire defense budget. The government's fiscal projections assume that inflation will remain around 2 to 3% indefinitely. Social Security's actuarial calculations assume the same. Medicare's projections assume the same. The entire federal budget is built on the assumption that official inflation remains low. Now imagine what would happen if the Bureau of Labor Statistics returned to the pre-1983 methodology. Imagine the official inflation rate suddenly jumped from 3% to 6%. Social Security costs would immediately increase by over $40 billion annually. Federal pension costs would increase by billions more. TIPS payments would surge. Tax brackets would have to rise faster, reducing revenue. The deficit would explode. The debt trajectory would become even more unsustainable than it already is. No politician would survive this. No administration would implement it. No Federal Reserve Chair would endorse it. The methodology can't be fixed because fixing it would reveal the true fiscal position. And the true fiscal position is that the government has been underfunding its obligations for 4 decades, using statistical manipulation to hide the gap. Think about what that means. The manipulation isn't incidental to the fiscal system. It's load-bearing. Remove it, and the structure collapses. That's why it will never be removed. This brings us to the present moment. In 2021 and 2022, official inflation surged to levels not seen in 40 years. For a brief moment, the CPI reported 7, 8, 9% inflation. Headlines screamed about the worst inflation in decades. And then, remarkably, it came back down. By late 2023, official inflation had retreated to 3 to 4%. By 2024, the Federal Reserve began declaring victory. But something strange happened during this period. Consumer sentiment collapsed and stayed collapsed, even as official inflation numbers improved. The University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, which tracks how Americans feel about the economy, remained near recessionary levels throughout 2023 and 2024, despite what the official numbers claimed was a robust economy with controlled inflation. Economists expressed puzzlement. They called it a mystery. They suggested Americans were irrational, influenced by partisan media, suffering from some kind of economic anxiety disorder. but there's a simpler explanation. The official numbers don't match lived experience. Americans aren't confused. They're correctly perceiving something the statistics are designed to hide. Grocery prices rose 25% between 2020 and 2024. Housing costs rose 30 to 50%, depending on the market. Auto insurance rose over 50%. Home insurance rose 30%. Healthcare costs continued their decades-long climb. The official CPI acknowledged some of these increases, then applied adjustments, hedonic improvements, substitution effects, owner's equivalent rent, and produced a number that claimed the crisis was over. Americans looked at their budgets and knew it wasn't. There's a deeper pattern here that reaches back centuries. Every empire that has accumulated unsustainable debt has eventually resorted to currency debasement. And every empire that has debased its currency has found ways to hide what it was doing. The Roman Empire provides the clearest example. The silver denarius, Rome's standard currency for centuries, originally contained about 4.5 grams of pure silver. By the time of Emperor Nero in 64 AD, the silver content had been reduced to about 3.8 grams. By the crisis of the 3rd century, denarii contained less than 5% silver. They were bronze coins with a thin silver wash. Roman emperors didn't announce they were debasing the currency. They didn't publish their methodology changes. They maintained the fiction that a denarius was still a denarius, worth what it had always been worth. But merchants knew. Prices rose, confidence collapsed. Eventually, the economic system itself collapsed. The modern equivalent of reducing silver content is manipulating the CPI. You don't reduce the physical content of the dollar. That's not how fiat currency works. Instead, you reduce the measured loss of purchasing power. You make it appear that each dollar is maintaining its value better than it actually is. The effect is identical. Real wealth is transferred from holders of currency to issuers of currency. The population becomes poor in real terms while official statistics claim otherwise. The Romans couldn't admit their currency was worthless until the empire fell. America can't admit its inflation statistics are false because too many obligations are indexed to them. That's the constraint. That's why it can't change. Let me be specific about who has paid the price. Anyone who retired with a fixed income in the past 40 years has been systematically robbed. Their Social Security benefits, their pension payments, their savings accounts have all lost purchasing power faster than official adjustments acknowledged. A retiree who stopped working in 1990 with what seemed like an adequate income found by 2020 that their purchasing power had eroded by far more than the official numbers suggested. The gap between official inflation and real inflation compounded every year. After 30 years, the cumulative impact is devastating. Workers whose wages are benchmarked to CPI have suffered the same fate. Union contracts often include inflation adjustments. Federal minimum wage discussions reference official inflation. When the official number understates real inflation, workers receive raises that don't keep pace with their actual cost of living. The result is visible in the data. Official statistics show that real wages, wages adjusted for inflation, have grown modestly over the past 40 years. But if you adjust wages using alternative inflation measures, real wages have fallen substantially for most American workers. This isn't a matter of interpretation. It's arithmetic. If you're measuring with a rigged yardstick, every measurement is wrong. Young people trying to buy homes have been hit hardest of all. The owner's equivalent rent methodology specifically excludes actual house prices from the CPI. This means that even as home prices tripled, quadrupled, quintupled relative to incomes, the official inflation rate barely noticed. A generation was priced out of homeownership, and the statistics said inflation was under control. There's one more mechanism that needs to be explained. The Federal Reserve uses official CPI as its primary measure of price stability. When the CPI is low, the Fed keeps interest rates low. When the CPI rises, the Fed raises rates. But if the CPI systematically understates inflation, the Fed is flying blind. It sets interest rates too low for actual economic conditions. This has consequences. Low interest rates inflate asset prices. Stocks, bonds, real estate, anything that can be purchased with borrowed money rises in price when interest rates are low. Those who own assets become wealthier. Those who don't own assets fall further behind. If the Fed had been using accurate inflation measures for the past 40 years, interest rates would have been higher. Asset prices would have risen more slowly. The wealth gap between asset owners and everyone else would be smaller. The understated CPI didn't just transfer wealth from dollar holders to dollar issuers. It transferred wealth from wage earners to asset holders, from young to old, from poor to rich. This is not an accident. It is a consequence of the measurement choice. The measurement choice was made by people who understood exactly what it would do. Let me address the standard objections. Some economists argue that alternative inflation measures are too simplistic. They point out that the economy has grown more complex, that quality really has improved, that substitution is a real phenomenon that affects consumer welfare. These arguments have merit in the abstract, but they ignore the asymmetry. Every methodological change since 1983 has pushed the CPI lower. If the goal were simply accuracy, you would expect some changes to increase the measured rate and others to decrease it. Instead, it's all in one direction. Other economists argue that the changes were made transparently through public processes with academic support. This is true. But transparency doesn't equal neutrality. The Boskin Commission was convened specifically to find reasons why the CPI overstated inflation. The answer was predetermined. The experts found what they were paid to find. Still, others argue that alternative inflation measures have their own biases. This is also true. But the existence of uncertainty doesn't justify always resolving that uncertainty in the government's favor. The pattern is clear. When fiscal pressure mounts, methodology changes. When those changes benefit the government and harm ordinary citizens, they're called improvements in accuracy. When the cumulative effect is a multi-trillion-dollar transfer of wealth, it's called economic science. This is historical and educational analysis, not financial or investment advice. So where does this leave us? The measurement lie cannot be undone because too many obligations depend on it. Social Security, federal pensions, TIPS bonds, tax brackets, the entire fiscal structure of the United States is built on a foundation of understated inflation. Acknowledging the truth would require acknowledging that the government has underfunded its promises for 40 years. It would require acknowledging that retirees have been systematically shortchanged. It would require massive new spending to correct the gap, and that spending would have to be financed with even more debt. The political system cannot do this. It cannot admit that the numbers have been wrong. It cannot make restitution. It can only continue the pretense and hope the gap doesn't become too visible. But the gap is becoming visible. When official statistics say inflation is 3% and voters feel like it's 8%, a credibility gap opens. Trust in institutions erodes, political anger grows, people begin to suspect that the system is rigged, even if they can't articulate exactly how. They're right to suspect. The system is rigged, not through conspiracy, but through methodology, not through lies, but through definitions. The numbers are accurate according to their definitions. The definitions were chosen to produce those numbers. History suggests this ends one of three ways. The first possibility is gradual adjustment. The methodology continues to evolve, always in ways that understate inflation, until the official numbers become completely disconnected from reality. At some point, people simply stop believing them, as Argentines stop believing their government's numbers. Official statistics become meaningless. Alternative measures emerge. Trust is lost. The second possibility is a fiscal crisis that forces acknowledgement. If the debt trajectory becomes so unsustainable that markets lose confidence, everything gets repriced at once. In that scenario, the gap between official and real inflation is closed violently through a currency crisis or a default. The adjustment that was spread across decades happens in months. The third possibility is that the current system continues indefinitely. The manipulation persists. Each generation is slightly poorer than it should be. The transfer continues. And because it's gradual, because it's hidden in methodology, because it requires technical understanding to perceive, no one ever builds enough political momentum to stop it. None of these possibilities is good. That's the point. There is no good option remaining. The choices were made decades ago. The methodology was locked in. The beneficiaries became dependent on it. And now the path is set. Think about what this means for anyone trying to plan for the future. If you're saving for retirement, the official inflation rate will tell you that your purchasing power is declining at 3% annually. Your financial plan will assume 3%. Your projections will be based on 3%. But if real inflation is 5%, or 6%, or 7%, your plan is wrong. Your projections are wrong. You will arrive at retirement with less purchasing power than you expected, and you will have no recourse because the official numbers said you were on track. This is the cruelest aspect of the measurement lie. It doesn't just transfer wealth, it destroys the ability to plan. It makes prudent behavior appear reckless in retrospect. It punishes people who trusted the numbers. Those who sensed the lie and bought assets were rewarded. Those who trusted the numbers and held cash were punished. The measurement lie is not just a fiscal tool, it's a mechanism for selecting winners and losers, and the losers are always those who play by the stated rules. I want to leave you with a question. Not a prediction, not a recommendation, just a question. If the government has been systematically understating inflation for 40 years, and if this understatement has been worth trillions of dollars in reduced obligations, what exactly would motivate them to stop? The beneficiaries of the lie are in power. The victims of the lie lack the technical knowledge to fight back. The economists who might expose it depend on government funding and establishment approval. The media lacks the patience to explain methodology. The mechanism is self-perpetuating. The incentives are aligned. The interests are entrenched. And so it continues. The question isn't whether inflation is actually under control. The question is whether the system that measures inflation can ever tell you the truth. History suggests it cannot. Math suggests it will not. Precedent suggests the pattern will continue until something breaks. The pattern is already in motion. Most people never examine the methodology behind the numbers they're given. They trust that official statistics reflect reality. They build their lives around that trust. This channel exists to examine the methodology, to study the mechanisms, to understand the systems before they break. Because by the time the autopsy is public, it's already too late.